Remember those cute kid shows you used to love?
Hiya, folks. Well, me.
Well, not like this, you don't.
50 cents, I'll suck your...
Someone out there is killing puppets.
What the?
Get ready for the Happytime Murders in cinemas August 23.
You're listening to Errol Parker and Clancy Overall, editors of the Batuta Advocate, on Desert Rock FM.
Hello again, listeners, and thank you for tuning in to the Batuta Advocate show here on Desert Rock FM, recorded live at the Koala Studios here in downtown Batuta. And thank you to all the people who have downloaded this show as a podcast listener. My name is Errol Parker, and with me, as always, is Clancy Overall.
Yes, hello. Thanks for joining us. We've got an interesting guest stopping in for a chat today. She's an investigative reporter from down there in the Harbour City. She works at Fairfax, and she's here to talk to us about cash, developers, and some of the few colourful characters that remain in that sterile hellhole.
Yeah, I'd imagine she'd love to stop in around Batuta Town Hall and get her hands on some of the stuff that's been happening down there as of late. I mean, without wanting to name names, I do wonder if the high approval rate for DAs has anything to do with some of our esteemed councillors and their new timeshare holiday house down there on Lake Eyre.
Well, hello, Mayor Carton, if you're listening. We're not accusing you of anything, mate. We're not accusing you of any wrongdoing. It's an interesting point, though. An interesting point you raise there, Errol. With all the stuff that's been happening across the state and the country, you would find it hard to believe that there's some gears that haven't been greased along the way.
Yeah, a couple of residents in our town have done very well out of those new projects, Clancy, and I'd imagine if you've been around town for as long as you have, you know that strings need to be pulled here and there to make puppets dance down there at Town Hall. And
just to make it clear, Councillor Carton, we are not accusing you of any wrongdoing.
But maybe some of the other councillors should be making a guest appearance at the new puppet movie coming out. What's it called? The Happytime Murders.
Yes, they could probably make a guest appearance at the CCC as well. It's the Crime and Corruption Commission for us Queenslanders down there in New South Wales. I'm sure you know it as ICAC. But yes, Errol, they wouldn't be wrongly cast as puppets in the new Happytime Murders movie, which is out in cinemas on August 23rd and is our sponsor this week.
And thank you to them. And a very warm welcome to today's guest, Fairfax reporter, investigative reporter, I should say, Michaela Whitbourn. She's just stepping in through the glass door now here in the booth here at Desert Rock.
Now, today's guest is a authority in the world of investigative journalism. I know Batuta Advocate has delved in this space and continues to do so. We've broken a lot of stories out here in the Diamantina area, but of course in the more metropolitan cities and suburbs, there's a lot more blatant corruption, and we haven't seen that kind of stuff since Joe. But the things are still alive and well and corrupt in the Harbour City. And Brisbane, of course, Melbourne as well.
And, of course, Ipswich.
Oh.
The gateway to the Darling Downs.
Yeah, the Triple C.
Riddled with corruption.
Having a great time out there. Now these people are quite often not brought undone if it weren't for the work of people like today's guests. The corrupt politicians, the corrupt businessmen, the corrupt developers.
And the corrupt systems.
That
enable them.
Of course, the petty criminals and all rungs of the fringe. And you've seen people like today's guest in movies like Spotlight or All the President's Men or, to a degree, Katie Holmes' character in Thank You for Smoking. Michaela Whitbourn, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we want to talk to you today about your job. We'd like to first start by, how would you describe your profession?
Well, we're a profession that at its best is holding the powerful to account and exposing systems and, people who otherwise wouldn't be exposed, like that no one else has an interest in writing about. Someone like Salim Mahaja, he was just a nobody really on council before the Herald started writing about him, and that was long before even his big wedding really put him on the radar for a lot of people.
So you guys were onto him before the wedding?
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
So one of my former colleagues, Leisha McKenny, was writing about him for a long time. In fact, I think our editors were sort of a bit perplexed as to why she was taking such an interest. But even then, he was covering himself in glory, just with sort of low-level silly antics that obviously evolved into something a lot bigger.
This is, of course, for our listeners in the Diamantina area that might not be familiar, Salim Mahaja, a controversial peacock now the Sydney almost social circles, the social scene, was a corrupt local councillor in the western suburbs who, went above and beyond where we ever thought he would remain as the deputy mayor of Auburn. He's since delved into assault and other things.
Well, of course, he's currently in the big house down there at the Cooma Country Club. I believe he's down there on a stretch for electoral fraud.
Yeah, that's right. So he's doing 11 months behind bars for electoral fraud, but that hasn't stopped him appearing in a lot of other courts while he's still in jail. So just yesterday he was appealing what has to be described as really a wet lettuce sentence for assaulting a cab driver. He thought that a 3-month good behaviour bond was probably a bit harsh and he ought to appeal that while he's in jail for rigging an election that got him elected to Auburn Council. So, you've got to give him credit for his tenacity, really.
Do you feel like some of these people that you spend a lot of time following and you get to see them in action, do you feel like a lot of them, what is it? Do they think they're above the law, or do they think that they can get out of everything? Or what's their attitude? Do they not care?
Yeah, I mean, I do spend a lot of time thinking about that because you do come to know them in a weird sort of personal way. Like, I've sat sort of like next to Salim in court. He knows who I am. He'll try and get me to write nice stories about him. Like, that's a conversation we've actually had. And I've tried to understand what it is that makes people like that tick and whether or not on some level they think that what they're doing isn't wrong at all.
Yeah.
Because often they're genuinely quite aggrieved that we are writing about them, and they feel like the biggest insult is our coverage of their poor behaviour, which is interesting. But I think on some level, and I did go to this conference a while back where someone was talking about the psychology of criminals and, corrupt politicians and people like that, they do actually convince themselves that they haven't done anything wrong. So they've entered into this parallel universe where the problem is everybody else talking about it and not their behaviour at all.
So kind of like a self-serving victim complex where they're being picked on.
Which I think is really, really interesting because if you have to be a super empathetic person to hold this view, but you can kind of feel sorry for them if they really feel like everyone is against them and that's totally unfair. That's quite a weight on them.
It'd be a convenient attitude to have, definitely when you fuck up.
Yeah.
So is there a parallel universe where investigative type reporters investigate people doing good things in the community? Or is it more or less about holding a torch to those who think they can get away with it?
Well, there's not really much point in us writing stories about nice things that happen, to be honest. Like, they might make a nice feature, and that's great, but it's the stories that people don't want you to write that really matter, and I don't think that there's anything new about that observation. But people do ask me that all the time. They ask me why it is that we're always focused on the negative and they'd really like to see a lot of positive stories. But I don't know that that's really borne out by what people read. People are worried about things that have a direct impact on their lives, and that's usually because something bad is happening or they're worried about something. And that's just the reality.
And public figures aren't going to hide how good they've been.
No, they don't tend to hide their light under a bushel in that respect. That is true.
Now, can you tell us, how do you get into the space you're in? Like, there's a lot of kids around the country studying journalism, studying how to get into media. Both Errol and I came up as cadets. How did you end up in investigative journalism? Was there a movie you watched, or was there something you read?
Yeah, not really. I just really liked writing things, and kind of the cost of writing things is that you need something to write about, and so you need to take an interest in something. And I come from a legal background, so I was a lawyer for a while, and so that was just kind of a natural fit. Like, I'm super interested in paper trails, and I'm very interested in like particular laws, law reform, that sort of thing. So I'm looking at the detail of things and picking things apart in that way. So that's my way into it, and that's how I got to really have a front row seat at a lot of these cases, which require both sort of an eye for colour, and there's a lot of sort of human drama and colour, but also like the technical detail of what's going on in court.
Now, speaking of paper trails,
which
I imagine if you know how to follow them and read them is riveting.
Yeah, it really is.
Have you ever had that moment where you've connected the dots and something hasn't added up and you've got someone?
Oh, it happens all the time. Like, I don't want to talk about Salim too much, but there's just been so many cases where he would just totally do my head in and say, black is white. And I'd just be like, well, I've done this company search and you are in fact the owner of Salim Mahaja Proprietary Limited, sole director, sole shareholder. So I think this, huge debt is in fact owed by you. And he'd just be like, no, Michaela, that's someone else's problem. So on a small level, you're doing that all the time. You're just going back to the detail of documents, and there's just such a sort of vast wealth of material out there on the public record, and you just need to know how to search it. And then it's just this treasure trove. And that happens all the time. It happens pretty much every day, and that's how you stack up a story.
Have you dealt with much of the corrupt kind of New South Wales government? Have you been put on any cases or yourself started chasing them yourself? Because there was a couple of decades there, and it's probably still happening, where just every other week there was someone giving someone a bottle of wine.
In the years just after Bob Carr pulled up stumps and went over the road to Macquarie Bank.
Yeah.
When the waters down there on Macquarie Street, they started to get a bit murkier.
Yeah, so I came into journalism in 2010 and started working in the New South Wales Press Gallery in 2011, and that was at the tail end of the Labor government. So there was already a lot of talk about pretty dodgy deals that may or may not have been done. And then ICAC really started taking a keen interest in that when Labor was voted out in March 2011. And that's when it had some of its huge inquiries into Eddie Obeid, Ian McDonald. Obviously, both of them are now in jail. And then later it turned its sight to the Liberals. And so that was really I spent years reporting on all those inquiries, and that was really sort of a turning point in my career. I hadn't been seeking out these stories, but we were writing about this every day. Every day brought a new scandal, a new MP having to stand down, a criminal trial as a result of an inquiry. And that's probably why I made the jump then from the Financial Review, where I was working at first, to the Herald, because they took a really keen interest in all those inquiries, and I was doing a lot of that work for the Fin. So yeah, I think I owe a lot of my career to Eddie Obeid, really, because just watching him and his mates at ICAC day after day was really a defining moment in my career.
Where did these guys end up? These incarcerated MPs, where do they end up? What are they? Is there a special jail for them? Is there
is it like a Labor wing?
Yeah.
Sort of specifically for the right faction. No. Look, it's not like high security prisons or anything, but they're just moved around. Ian McDonald was complaining recently. My colleague reported that he kept on being moved around and his wife didn't have the access to him that he wanted, which is a burden on the family.
Yeah.
So he's been bellyaching about that, or his family has.
So you said you moved over from the Financial Review a few years ago, and then you would have slotted in under the godmother of Australian investigative journalism, Kate McClymont. What was it like to suddenly go from the Fin Review to being in the same desk, really?
As Kate McClymont?
Yeah.
It was huge. I mean, she's a really generous reporter, really generous with her time. She's obviously sort of like an icon in Sydney and probably Australian journalistic circles. Her contact book is ridiculous. She's always talking to people who know everything. So she brings this real sort of this charm and sort of innocence to a job that's anything but, which is quite endearing. And I think that's how you get people to open up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You get people to get a bit maternal even, or sisterly.
Yeah, there's certainly sort of quite an empathetic and she has a very sort of caring approach to dealing with everyone, I think. I've heard her on the phone before Eddie went to jail saying she needed to seek comment from him for a story, and she was just like, "Oh, hello, Eddie, it's Kate McClymont here," as though they were in any way sort of on speaking terms, which is really very sweet.
How does it feel to be chasing down scary guys? Obviously you and Kate are in the same boat. She probably is on a few more lists than you. I'm not saying hit lists or anything, but there's people that will want to get back at you.
Off the Christmas card list.
Yeah, which really cuts me, to be honest, not to be getting one from Ian McDonald this year. I guess I don't really think about it. I think in many ways we just sort of have this disconnect between what we're doing and what we're writing, and you can't really think too much about what people will think about it. And most of the time, to be honest, the stories that you expect to get a lot of direct criticism about, you saying that someone's corrupt or just some really, very forceful allegation that's obviously hugely damaging to them, they usually don't come back at you. because you've already stood the story up and there's not that much that can be said. To be honest, like the worst feedback and kind of the scariest things that have ever been said to me are from people who really didn't have that much cause for complaint. Like it might have been a really minor or low level slight, but they were just super worried about it. So with kind of the big fish of the criminal world, to the extent that I write about them, I don't really think about it. Like, to be honest, it would worry me if they thought that there was any real interest in sort of taking me out or trolling me on social media or whatever else. Like, what's the point of that? There's always someone else who can pop up and do my job. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, right. Now, I just want to ask, you're big on defamation. You kind of cover a lot of that.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this current example of Sarah Hanson-Young suing David Leyonhjelm? This is federal politicians. Kind of the first sitting politician to sue another sitting politician. What do you think is going to come of all this, and where could that then take us? Yeah,
well, it's super interesting, and one of the reasons why a sitting MP hasn't sued another sitting MP before, or their senators, is that most of the time when they say grossly unflattering things about each other, they limit it to inside Parliament.
Yeah.
And you can't sue over that because it's privileged.
Yeah.
So the problem is that David Leyonhjelm doubled down repeatedly outside Parliament. So in some respects, he's getting what is coming to him, like there is sort of this protection there, and maybe it shouldn't be if they're making really personal comments about each other. But he didn't limit himself to that, so that's why this case is being brought and why one hasn't been brought before, at least under the new laws, which were introduced in 2005-06.
Would you think that could just, if they, for example, removed the privilege, or everyone was accountable for what they said in any interview ever, do you think they could just be defamation suits left, right and centre across? Yeah,
well, that's an interesting question. Sydney is already one of the defamation capitals of the world, if not the defamation capital.
So sensitive.
I know. And, well, we can't really attribute it just to the fact that people here have massive egos. Like, our laws are not particularly good at protecting free speech. So in other parts of the world, there are more protections for people, including the public figure doctrine in the US, which means that it's really quite difficult for a public figure to bring an action for defamation unless they can show that someone acted maliciously, which is a really high bar. And in the UK, they've brought in some tests that sort of knock out trivial claims more readily, and we don't have anything like that on the books here, really. So, there's a lot going on in our laws that probably needs to be reformed to give us a bit more room to move, because a lot of these cases don't really need to be brought. And there's always the question of the Streisand effect. So when you're trying to suppress something, it really just draws a lot more attention to it. But I totally understand a person feeling aggrieved and like this is the only way to vindicate their reputation.
Well, I noticed that the Herald has just had another defamation case brought against it for a very lengthy investigative report into one of Australia's most highly decorated soldiers.
Yes.
If a defamation law, by the definition of it, if they were more powerful, can journalism like that exist where if you need to jump through all these types of hoops just to get something published?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's already pretty difficult for us to write stories like that, and we would welcome any reforms to the law that would make it easier for us to do our job. But obviously, Fairfax is not deterred from writing those big stories because there's a legal risk. We weigh it all up, and we still write stories that matter, regardless of that. We just take a lot of care in stacking them up, knowing those risks involved.
So have there been any stories where you've come to the editor and then the editor's gone to the legal department, and then the legal department's come back to the editor and gone, probably let this one go?
Too hot.
That's never happened to me.
Right.
Maybe that's because I'm already sort of self-censoring, because I sort of run my own legal eye past it and make my own judgment about that. And I probably wouldn't bowl up something that I thought was risky. But I don't really hear that happening by and large. The question is always, we just need to marshal a lot of evidence to support this story, not that, just before it even gets off the ground, before we've done any investigation, we're just not doing it because of the legal risk. I've never heard of that.
Now, any other mentors that you've kind of seen along the way? Obviously, there's Kate McClymont. Chris Masters is behind this one. He's one of the writers behind this most recent one that's resulted in a defamation case for the Fairfax media. And he has done some big hitters. He kind of brought down Joe, essentially. He has written Jonestown. He's written a lot of stuff and is quite fearless. How many of them are there in Australia, would you say?
There's not that many, but I've been lucky to meet a lot of them. So when I was at the Financial Review, Neil Chenoweth was one of my colleagues, and he's just an amazing reporter who does that same sort of forensic reporting. So he exposed, Graham Richardson, his Swiss bank accounts, and he's sort of involved in sort of every big story you can think of. And he just sort of took me under his wing without me even asking, which is probably one of the nicest things that's happened to me in my career. And that's what you find in this profession, that people go out of their way to help you, even though there's no sort of direct personal reason for them to do that. So I think he's one of the giants of the industry, really, as is Kate McClymont. Angus Grigg at the Financial Review is also great, and he was one of the first reporters writing about Eddie Obeid and his coal-rich property in the Bylong Valley, which is the subject of another criminal trial coming up next year that's expected to take 6 months. And that was one of the biggest stories that was written about Obeid. And obviously Kate wrote heaps about, and literally wrote the book about Eddie as well.
Does it ever get a bit funny when you look at the underworld, and there's a lot of different kind of cogs and that kind of stuff, and a good example of this is that guy that went to jail the other day. Medic was his name.
Ron Medic, yes.
Medic, and the bloke he'd knocked off, and these crims all live this very volatile life of relationships, and the kind of the fourth estate's in there as well. Like, there's things that have unfolded as a result of Herald articles. Does it feel weird to be part of that machine where it's like, maybe someone's been sent away, or someone's changed their whole operation because of something that Michaela Whitbourn wrote?
Yeah, or maybe more like Kate McClymont wrote.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that is really fascinating, and it happens all the time. Yeah. So, Kate and others have triggered ICAC inquiries, and the same thing with the Medic trial. Like, she knew about that pretty much before it happened, So McGurk was saying that he thought he was going to be killed.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, what the Herald and other journalists do is break stories that lead to these inquiries in criminal trials. We're not just passive bystanders. At the same time, I'm not particularly keen on reporters who see themselves as part of the story, or they are in fact the story. And I don't think anyone at the Herald is really like that. Like, a first-person piece about your experience of reporting on a case, to me, is just like the worst thing imaginable.
So there's no Hunter S. Thompsons at the...
There's no gonzo business. No, none of that.
There's no one there who aspires to work at Vice one day?
Not to my knowledge.
No, but just on the topic of youth media outlets, in this age of shrinking newsrooms at all these old mastheads, is there anyone coming up, or is it just kind of like a one-way street where everyone's walking out and no one's walking in?
No, I'm totally encouraged by it, and it's starting to make me feel quite old, actually, because I have very young budding journalists coming to me and asking me how you get into this business.
Right.
And there's just so much talent there, and they're scarily smart. So Lane Sainty at BuzzFeed, who started to do a lot of legal reporting, she's amazing. She's across all these issues, and she's across every platform. And there's just so many lanes, I'm not at all pessimistic about the future of journalism. I don't think that it's dying at all. It's changing its form. But that's a really good thing for consumers. So the only thing that I'm worried about really is people taking my job. Apart from that, it's fine.
Keep them underneath you anyway. Keep them in their fenced off little pen.
Exactly.
Also, there's other avenues for journalists now as well. There is, of course, you've got your book in you. Everyone's got a book in it. Kate's published
everyone.
And you might even have your own teacher's pet in you. I'm sure.
Well, exactly.
Yeah,
and you could probably do both.
Yeah.
A book off the back of your podcast. Yeah, I've done none of these things. No. People ask me all the time if I want to write a book, say, about Salim.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I want to yoke myself to him in perpetuity. So, no.
So, that would be. Is that the Salim writer? Yeah, that would be. Wouldn't that be?
It's not for me. Also, I think until you can really kind of unlock the enigma, the riddle that is Salim, there's not really much point, and I don't understand him psychologically yet.
Yeah.
That's the work of a lifetime.
Right.
Well, we've had this conversation with a few other people in our industry about paying for journalism,
Yeah.
and about how there's going to be a time where this golden age of getting your journalism for free is going to come to an end. Like, we've had this discussion with our board about putting up a paywall. We've had a discussion with our editorial team and our editors. At the moment, the mood is to not do one, but as we've observed a lot of other media outlets like Fairfax and News Corp and all the other big boys, they've all started to do it. Do you think there's a change coming from where everyone now, if you want access to journalism, is going to have to pay for it?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing. So consumers were kind of perhaps lulled into this notion that you could get your news for free because there was no paywall online. But before the advent of Alliant, obviously they were paying for it in the form of a newspaper.
Yeah.
And there was no real problem with that concept. So it's convincing consumers that they need to start paying for something that they previously paid for in a different form.
Yeah.
So that's the trick, that's the difficult thing. And doing that in an environment where there are many other players who are essentially riding on our coattails and offering that information for free, that's the problem for us.
Yeah, it is interesting because you've just got to condition the consumer. They were conditioned to pay
Yes.
$2 a day for the newspaper, and I guess there's an element of the Napster generation as well.
Yes.
Peer-to-peer
Yeah.
sharing. But yeah, the big concern is it a concern of yours when you've spent that much time writing something and then you see it rehashed on, youth-orientednews.com, as reported by Michaela Whitbourn.
With a GIF or two
Yeah,
in the middle of it.
Yeah, to the extent that I'm known for anything outside of the subjects I report on, I think it's for my rage tweets associated with the Daily Mail ripping off my stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they tend to get the most traction of anything I do, which is encouraging. But yeah, of course, that's a huge problem, and that's their business model. They don't actually go out and seek news, they just repurpose ours, repackage it, including often taking our photos and, just lifting our interviews with whoever, which is pretty shocking. But yeah, that's what we're dealing with. But we're hoping that people would pay for the quality analysis and the form of, the stories that you would get in the Herald and not in the Daily Mail where the headline's, 17 lines long. And they use a criminal number of adjectives. But, that's a matter for consumers.
So basically, for example, where you'd spend a lot of your time down at the Downing Centre, what media outlets have got a person on the ground there? Got you guys at Fairfax?
So most of the established media outlets would have someone down there, and we're sort of scouring the court lists every day and making a decision about what needs to be covered. But you don't really see the Daily Mail or any of those other online outlets coming to court ever. I think sometimes they might be applying to the court for documents, but the thing about that is that they don't really want to give them to people who weren't even in court to hear what the significance of that evidence, because that's probably not going to be a fair and accurate report. There's not that many of us on the ground, and it tends to still be the established media outlets and maybe with a couple of others. Like BuzzFeed would cover things with a person in court and not picked up later.
Can you tell us, how is it spending your life in the courts? Like, is it a lot of characters getting around? And
Oh my God.
Is it
Yes.
is it a little world of its own?
Yeah, it's a complete ecosystem, and the characters in it are more colourful and bizarre than you can ever imagine, which is just amazing. Like, it's this gift every day, but also completely mind-boggling. You can't believe these people are real.
Yeah.
Just even snippets of conversation that you hear just around the traps, saw some kind of pretty offensively dressed solicitor, huge lurid tie, that kind of setup, just telling his client listen, this magistrate is mad as a cut snake. That kind of advice being offered. That's the high level stuff. And that's the kind of thing you hear in the Downing Centre all the time. But yeah, you just see the most extraordinary stuff in court every day, and you're reporting on people who get to know that you're reporting on them, and that's super weird. But it's a privilege too.
Have you ever walked past something you knew nothing about and gone, whoa, I've got to go in here, this looks fun?
Yeah, that happens all the time. So you're sitting in one matter and maybe there's a huge list of cases that are being dealt with, and it's kind of oh, this one's possibly more interesting than the one that I was in. So yeah, that happens all the time. It's just a lot of this job is luck.
Now, is there anything coming up that you think, is there anything, is there currently a type of story you think that could be coming in the future that is of OB-esque, or is there anything happening in this in this country or in New South Wales that has got you got your ears pricked?
Obeid's set a pretty high bar. There are still MPs in New South Wales doing dodgy things and they've learnt no lessons at all from ICAC. On that same level, not really. I thought that Salim was my next Obeid, and to some extent he was, but he's in prison now. So yeah, we're looking for the next one of those. Yeah. And I'll say no more lest my journalistic rivals take a note or two.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. No, not really. No.
So just one thing though, I think that we need to touch on is the merger.
Yep.
I think that took a lot of people by surprise, but it also took some people not by surprise.
Yeah, well, I think it's something that had been sort of rumoured for a while, so I don't think that the concept was entirely new to anyone. The timing of it, I think, surprised most people. Like, we didn't think it was imminent. There had been discussions in the past. So, yes, that seems to be happening, although it's got to clear some hurdles.
Yeah. So what does that mean for the newsroom, really? Does that mean you're going to have to relocate possibly up to Willoughby, up to Channel 9, up to Media Town?
North Sydney seems to be the word,
Right.
because Nine also has office space there.
Yeah.
So that seems to be happening, but not in the next year or so. As to the way we go about the business of writing stories, there seems to be no change there.
Yeah. Keep your head down.
We don't have to do like a co-pro with Carl Stefanovic, for the weekend or anything. So, yeah.
So, what do you think is going to be the go when they start? You know those famous stories, and we've seen a couple, or at least 3 or 4 big ones in the last year. A Four Corners brought to you by Fairfax and ABC.
Yeah.
What's going to happen there? Do you reckon that'll remain? Will you be able to partner with ABC, or will that be put out on 60 Minutes instead?
Yeah. Well, there's been speculation about that, and I know that the Oz was very quick out of the blocks to say that was dead in the water with some degree of glee. But I don't know if that is or isn't the case. I don't think there's been any confirmation either way. So we'll just see what happens. Yeah.
So would that open up a pathway potentially for you to close the laptop and start appearing in front of the camera for 60 minutes?
Well, that's always been the end game, to be honest, that and accessing the Channel 9 wardrobe. They've got some pretty snappy outfits in there, and they're beyond my budget at present.
I think what most people who are concerned about journalism were sort of most concerned about is how much cross-pollination the two companies would have.
Yeah, well, as we've been told that we just continue doing what we do,
Yeah.
and we'll just keep doing that.
So it's just business.
You're the Herald, yeah.
Yeah, we've
Sydney
got a very
Morning Herald's
distinct
the Herald.
brand, and it's a brand that matters.
So Fairfax is 9, Sydney Morning Herald is Sydney Morning Herald.
Basically, the biggest change will be the logo on your business cards.
That's probably
I guess.
right,
Yeah.
yes.
Now, just quickly, someone who works predominantly for the Sydney Morning Herald,
Yeah.
when you were with the AFR, was that you were kind of national, or like could you if you get whisper of something that's happening big, up in Triple C, and you've got the tip off, could you drive up to Ipswich, or is Sydney Morning Herald would prefer you focused on New South Wales corruption, which there's an abundance of?
I think in both newsrooms that I've worked in, if you've got a big story, then that's your story and you can chase it.
Yeah.
But I mean, once you start writing in a particular area, you just develop so many contacts that are telling you about things happening in this city. So that's just the way it really works in practice.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you have a big story, of course they're interested in it, and there's no real restriction on that.
Yeah.
You might get other people involved if they're closer to the action, or you could benefit from working with them. But I've never had anyone say that story is not on your patch, so you should step off.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen.
So you wouldn't have to handball it to the good people at the Brisbane Times, for example?
No. If you had a big story and you had the contacts to write it, you write the story.
Yeah. So it's quite fluid in that sense. Like, say if you did get a tip off and you went up there and you broke the story about, what was his name? Pasali, the mayor of Ipswich. And then you got another one, and would Fairfax allow you to kind of just stay there? Or?
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
It's just not really that likely to happen in practice. Then you'd be talking to people who work up there all the time, and then their contacts would probably help them out, and then probably they just assume the running of the story.
Yeah,
It
so you
wouldn't
do
really
have your
happen.
lane. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we wish you well into the future. We hope that you do get your golden goose, I guess you could say. Salim is in jail, though. It would have been better if he lasted another 10 years and you could have...
But the saga could not be over.
Well, yeah, quite. It's never over. He's got another trial coming up for staging a car crash, allegedly, to avoid appearing in a trial for assault, to which he subsequently pleaded guilty. To the assault, not the car crash.
Staging the car accident.
Yeah, I guess that everyone in his legal team has been eating steak for a while.
Would have thought so, and good luck to them.
Yeah.
He's given them plenty of work. Thank you for joining us today, Michaela.
Thanks for having me.
And yeah, all the best with your future breaks.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you for joining us, Michaela Whitbourn, down here at Koala Mattress Studios, Koala Sofa Studios. Thank you, Koala, for sponsoring this podcast.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how Fairfax and Nine continue their tango off into the future. I'm sure there'll be quality journalism still seeping out of their pores.
Yes, all we can hope for, I have to say, Errol. Anyway, until next time, I'm Clancy Overall. You be kind to each other.
And my name is Errol Parker. Please, for the love of God, stay out of the pokies.
Thank you.